So before we get into the technology aspect of it, I want to talk a little bit about the mindset and the aesthetic of the Fallout universe. Now, if some of you know and some of you don't know, that's fine. I'm going to go over some stuff about the Fallout universe that might not be obvious to a lot of people. And one of the things is that the Fallout universe is a satirical and somewhat parodied view of what our future was supposed to look like back in the 1950s. Bear in mind that this was post-war America, post-war North America, and our idea of the atom, atomic technology, nuclear technology was very much influenced by the promise that we would never use these things for such destruction as we had already done. This was a really big thing that was done because you don't want the only foray into this new technology to be the bad one. And unfortunately, it was a horrific event, and it still remains kind of the worst case scenario. Nobody wants to even think about the possibility of those types of things being used again. So a lot of our output as far as the social aspect of it went into acclimating the public to know atomic technology can be beneficial. We could do a lot of things with it. There was a lot of promises to it. Fast forward to today and we see new technologies pop up all the time. We don't sometimes have this view that the technology is going to be great. Somebody says, okay, is this the next iPhone or is this the next bubble? You know, when is this technology going to end? Right now we're kind of seeing it with electric cars. The ups and downs of the Tesla Corporation, the ups and downs of automatic driving cars. And what it all boils down to, not something I really kind of talk about too much, is that as humans, we have trouble trusting technology fully unless we can control it. Being gamers, that kind of goes hand in hand. We like controlling our technology. So one of the first things about it, and I'll get into the technology a little bit, is we have these posters and stuff. These are posters put out by, and this one's not that great. I'll have better ones in a minute here, but it's called the Health and Physics Office. And this was produced in the 40s and the 50s. And there were these posters, and it's kind of very similar to what you see in the actual Fallout game, which is this poster. It's pretty much the same poster. Radiation need not be feared, but it must command your respect. And this is sort of key about, you know, the aesthetic of Fallout itself. So we have some other posters. These are real posters that were used. If you're a fan of Fallout, if you've played any of the Fallout games, you'll kind of see the similarities. These are real things that were produced in the 1950s. And here we go. We have a hand count in time saves 9, health physics for your protection. This one sounds weird. What it is this character here has not washed his hands after using radioactive material in his job place, and he is irradiating his dinner for his family. So this is a warning poster telling you to wash your hands after handling radioactive material. Of course, we know nowadays that that's not quite how it works. Back then, the knowledge and study of radiation just wasn't as prolific as it is. We know a lot more now. Here's another one. This is a poster that talks about how long you're allowed to work with radioactive technology and the exposure to rads. This was a very real thing. Workers would get sick if they were exposed for too long for certain periods during the day. Of course, nowadays we realize that radiation exposure wasn't something that just went away, and we have a lot more stringent procedures for dealing with radioactive technology, special suits, special laboratories, and so forth. This is a funny poster. Seems like it could have come straight out of Fallout. It's instructions for caring for a wound that you got from a radioactive material. Say you scraped your hands on some plutonium. This is how to scrub the radiation out of the wound. Again, this is definitely not how it works. And this is very real. Of course, you have someone call the health department as soon as possible. This should probably read, have someone call the health department, period. And the further instructions would be go to a hospital, and by the way, now you're irradiated. You'll have to have treatment. It was not pretty. This poster is kind of interesting, basically instructing workers to always keep their Geiger counters with them. And there was also these other little meters, which are the
Geiger counter.
so this is the Geiger counter with little probes here, but there was also a couple other meters that were color-based. They changed colors depending upon how much radiation you had. There was things that kind of looked like thermometers that they also reacted with the rads. This is, if you forget your meter, forgotten meters measure no radiation. Well, it's obvious. I forgot my, but the idea being each worker responsible for knowing how much rads they were in any given time. Here we have something that was very real from Picture Parade magazine. There's no real context to it other than if anybody's familiar with the movie A Boy and His Dog, another post-apocalyptic adventure. This was well before that, September 1953, or 1953 it looks like. Again, it's the mindset that, yeah, this atomic stuff is scary, but we don't have to be scared of it. And of course, we know a little bit better nowadays, but this is very real. Some other things we'll show you along the way as we get to it, but yeah. We have a cultural pamphlet talking about how radiation can be used in technology. First one's kind of obvious. It was for medical uses. And that was actually very real. And we have it today as well, X-rays, radiation therapy for various illnesses. Then they talk about how the nuclear material is being produced in the other panels. And the third one is that it'll create more jobs. And the jobs being a person who goes around finding out how much radiation is around. Basically, a guy to tell you how sick you're going to get from the things that are supposed to cure you. And then, of course, the last one is the advertisement for Taylor Instruments, which depicts the little thermometer device I mentioned before. We have another very real ad from the 1950s. This one depicts what kind of things that atomic power is going to help us with in the future. Again, we start with medical technology, which is pretty much one of our uses that we see almost every day. The other use was that they mentioned, and this is something that we didn't understand back then, they assumed that radiation caused beneficial mutation. That's extremely rare and extremely, the chances are super low. It's not just rare, it's so rare that thinking that back then that could be beneficial. So the middle panel at the bottom talks about how radiation can be used to increase the growth of vegetables. So we're irradiating our food now. Very wonderful. And the third one talks about putting nuclear reactors in vehicles and other types of things that I'm going to put your kids in later anyway. So, just getting back into Fallout. Part of the Fallout universe is the sort of the fun of we parody this 1950s attitude. We have the Nuka-Cola Corporation, and they have their wonderful homage to the rockets that blasted, or the rockets that were being built to protect America, according to the game lore. And this is actually based on a very real Coca-Cola marketing effort. And I have a picture of that. Oh no, that's the wrong picture. Hold on. Here we have our Coca-Cola image, the little astronaut. He's sitting on top of the Coke there, and he's going to blast off into space, and things go better with Coke. So it's, art imitates life. We like to see a little bit of the lighter aspect of things. Not everything is radiation and nuclear with this kind of stuff. So here we have a pretty real ad for a toy called the Atom Bomber. This little toy plane had a button on the back. Push it, drop the little atom bomb. This is, and of course we have the little friendly atomic symbol at the bottom. This particular symbol, and you'll see it a lot in the Fallout as well. It was the universal symbol for atomic technology and power, and pretty common. So getting into the technology, one of the technologies was the mini nuke and the miniaturization of nuclear devices, both power type devices and this one's an explosive device, obviously. And while efforts to miniaturize nuclear weapons have created things that are similar to this nature in our modern times, and when I mean modern times, in the past 10 years, back in the 50s, and when this attitude was brought forward, this was sort of fantasy. So much so that a Pulp Fiction novel was written about a miniaturized atomic bomb. This novel is a mystery romance about a spy who has a miniature nuclear bomb. Maybe we'll look back in 40 years upon this era and think about, oh wow, did you guys hear back in 2018, this is what they thought about lightsabers or something like that. But this is also a real Coca-Cola marketing. This is the Tintin rocket from the Tintin series. Coca-Cola marketed this mostly in Japan. So again, art imitates life. The fusion core. Fusion core is a little misleading. It's described as a fusion device, and fusion is very rare in the real world. Fusion is extremely volatile. We have gigantic laboratories right now that are the size of this hotel, even larger, doing fusion. Fusion is a process by which we put together matter and it releases an incredible amount of energy. But we do have a device called a radioisotope thermoelectric generator. No, that's a big long word.
Repeat that again.
Radioisotope thermoelectric generator. So the first word, radioisotope, it's radioactive. Typically polonium or very small amounts of uranium are used in it, mostly polonium. Thermoelectric is the type of energy it generates. So it uses thermoelectric couplers, which are very inefficient, but they're very good at long-term use and use in which you know that your power source isn't going to diminish within a certain amount of time. So thermoelectric coupling is used to create energy from heat. And then the generator, meaning that it is not a battery per se, as in it won't lose amperage over time. It is a constant wattage producer. So I have a picture of one of those. Actually, that's not the generator. That's the source of it. This is a polonium pellet. This is about the size of a pinky finger. It's glowing red not because it's been heated up. It's glowing red because it's radioactive. And if you don't quite understand radioactivity or believe what's really going on, it's like, oh yeah, we have a microwave. My microwave doesn't glow red. It's not the same in raw nature. Now this has been coated with graphite so that it doesn't immediately start to decay. That's kind of scary if you think about it. This thing just sits there and is very hot on its own. So we put this into these generators. This is a kind of a complicated, not really complicated, this is a side view diagram of the generator. We have the radioactive core here, and then the thermocouplers are actually these little panels here. And they get warm, generate electricity, and then we have cooling tubes and a couple of other support mechanisms here, insulation. There's also excess heat. This thing can get pretty high pressure. They can explode, and it's not fun. So just to give an idea of how big these things, or how we actually do use these things. And these things, so this is the not Mars, I'm sorry. This is our space program. This is an actual radioisotope thermoelectric generator being reloaded. So the generator is actually at the astronaut's legs there, and he's got the core of it in his tongs there. And it looks like the core is bigger than the actual generator, but what he's actually holding is the lead shield for the core, because it's a big bar of polonium. It's very radioactive. And he's going to drop it in there. And this was used to actually power a couple space missions that we had. We used it to power the Voyager mission. The Mars rover Curiosity is powered by one of these. We have a couple of satellites that are powered by it. This particular one, I believe, generates about 850 watts. And it will generate 850 watts for about 85 years. And at that point, it'll generate 830 watts because of the half-life of the radioactive material. And in space, it's very useful because something bad happens in space. There's a lot of other extra radiation that's already out in space. It doesn't matter. And a lot of people don't know that either. There's more radiation in space than we could possibly put up there. To give an idea of a more size of these things, yes, they were produced for terrestrial use. These are radioisotope generators. These are essentially radioactive batteries. These are used in various applications. Typically, there's a couple of lighthouses that the Russians use. Let me get my notes here. Anyway, there's a couple lighthouses that are powered by it. There's I believe excuse me. There's a weather station in Alaska that's powered by one. Russia had some study of these in the past, and during the Cold War and during the subsequent collapse of certain Russian blocks, people would actually find these laying around at abandoned sites. This is an abandoned radioisotope thermoelectric generator that was just, and there's a couple of them actually in this photograph. Tourists who kind of went past the fences that said, "Warning, don't go in here, radioactive," found 10 or 13 of these. They've been stripped of a lot of their materials, but not the radioactive cores. People who salvage these, they know exactly what. Yeah, you have a question?
Yeah. How much do these typically cost?
So these are kind of. It's more about the expense of the actual radioactive material that's in them. That's where most of the expense comes from. So the actual shell of these and stuff don't cost much more than what your typical high capacity capacitor system that's like on a telephone pole. And that's anywhere in the range of, depending upon the materials, the outer core of it from $5,000 to $10,000. The core itself is what's super expensive. I don't have numbers on that, but I think it's somewhere up in the range of $500,000 for just one. But the thing is that, again, these were produced, these were probably the only ones produced at this facility over a course of 30 years, and they were abandoned. It's just more or less for infrastructure and cost. They cost a lot of money, but they work very well. Our Voyager probe is going to last for quite a few years because of one of them. Technically, our Mars rover Curiosity could last longer because of it, but it actually uses more power than the Voyager probe did. So, but thank you for the question. So, this idea that we could create these and the actual battery itself is something that's fun to think about. Could we miniaturize it? Could we get to that point in the future? Probably. Is it going to be cheap? No. Well, people think it's safe. We get into a lot of these philosophical arguments. How far do we really want to go with all of this technology? We want to say, eventually, will our cell phones have radioisotope batteries in them? We'll never have to charge our cell phones again. Is that a reality? Probably not. But if you know anything about lithium ion or anything about the actual chemicals that are in cell phone batteries, those are actually pretty nasty in and of themselves in raw nature. So what we tend to worry about in all this technology is what bad things can happen if it breaks, but not because it's a failure of the device, but a physical, mechanical failure. What happens if these things are cracked open? And the thought is scary. Moving over to a little bit lighter side of things, in the Fallout world, we have this doomsday prep, this idea, and it's very real in America in the 50s, 60s, and 40s, and for good reason. Our ability to keep things secret wasn't as good or wasn't as well honed as it is nowadays. And the idea that we were going to use, or there was the possibility of atomic war, was a big thing. And these products here, you can kind of see we have the Dandy Boy apples, the sugar bombs, all these kind of box materials. Oh, wow, sorry about that. It's sort of the aesthetic of the Fallout universe, but it's not off from what we actually had. You know, we've got these different brands. We call you Spam. You know, there's cram Spam. You know, Campbell's soup. But a lot of this stuff, it was definitely part of the aesthetic and the preparation and the mindset back then. People would have basements thinking that it would be good enough, stock full of all kinds of things. No, there are still people today that prep like that too. But here we have, this is actually, according to the research, this picture was at a sort of a social function, and it was sort of like the equivalent of a Tupperware party, or I don't know if you guys remember that, maybe a Mary Kay party or an Avon party, but for doomsday preppers. It was buy your doomsday supplies from me, and then you can also sell doomsday supplies to other people, kind of thing. And we kind of see some interesting aesthetics. These are actual photos from back then. You can see the crossover. If you're a fan of Fallout, you'll recognize the various ideas and stuff. And where, yeah, this stuff was definitely very prolific. Here we have another one of those tongue-in-cheek sort of, oh, it's okay. We have a bomb shelter. By the way, come swim in our pool until it's time to get in the bomb shelter. You know, it's a very, you know, sort of an exciting time to be purchasing these things, apparently. Moving on to this little thought about what we didn't understand about radioactive technology. And this is sort of a, not necessarily a comic book. This was a comic book that was created as an informational graphic novel. And, you know, our various agencies still kind of produce these. They'll have, you know, educational comic books and things like that, talk about various things. We have, you know, talk about, you know, all kinds of things from crime and drug use. But back then, this was an informational sort of graphic novel about radiation being our enemy or our friend. Of course, the depiction here in the bottom left is of what looks like an alien, but no, that is supposed to be a human that has beneficial mutation. His brain mass has increased. And so now he's teaching others about chemistry. Of course, the unfortunate characters at the top are being shot by a radioactive weapon. This was not intended to be a comic book. This was intended to be the possibilities of our radioactive future. So, tongue-in-cheek, when we get to look at things in the Fallout universe and say, oh wow, super mutants, that's pretty cool. I wonder where those guys came from. Came from all of these science fiction writers that work for the government. Of course, in the Fallout universe, we have a really fun depiction of mutations. We have the marsupial mutation depicted here, where you can jump higher. Of course, that's from Fallout 76.
Who said that?
Breaks the game. You can get on top of things.
It does.
Get on top of things you're not supposed to get on top of.
I have the cannibal perk.
The cannibal. So, moving up to the aesthetic of our technology. This is it's a Chrysler, and you see if my notes say, I forgot the name of it, 100%.
Says at the top left there, Corsair.
Oh yeah, Corsair. So it's the Chrysler Corsair from GM. I thought it was, I'm sorry, not Chrysler, GM Corsair, 1948. Yeah, thank you so much for pointing that out. I knew that I left myself some key points here. This is not necessarily part of the nuclear age, but it was part of the mindset and the technology back then that we actually see mirrored in the Fallout universe. Being at the idea that our future was going to be mostly in cars. Mindset was that cars were part of our future. We were going to be touring across the country in all these energy-efficient cars, some of them powered by nuclear power plants. Whole family would get into the car, and this particular concept was a touring vehicle with canopy glass that you could view all kinds of surroundings with. And of course, nowadays, nobody really wants to be stuck in traffic, and a lot of people work from home. A lot of people work in big cities where people just don't have cars. There's also the environmental impact. But you do have sort of the influence here. Vault-Tec van with its canopy windows. Not necessarily a technological mirror, but aesthetic mirror. Kind of like to see where these things come from. But we do get into the foray of where the technology comes from. This is a concept nuclear vehicle. I think I have this is the Ford Nucleon. Much like the cars that are depicted in Fallout, the Corvegas and other vehicles, this is a concept nuclear car that was created by Ford in 1962. This little area back here is the cooling system for a real nuclear reactor. When they developed this vehicle, they discovered that the amount of shielding needed to protect the drivers and passengers of the car created basically a little bit of a loop in equivalently thermoconversion entropy, which means that the amount of power that the engine would need to produce in order to propel the vehicle with that much shielding was equivalent to the amount of shielding and the weight and thrust. Basically, 0 miles per gallon is the equivalent. It took more energy to propel the vehicle than the vehicle is actually capable of producing. They thought that we would have the ability to kind of shrink these down to make them better, and we kind of did, but the abandonment of the research into it was also due in part to the fact that if you wanted to drive one of these, each car would be nowadays around $2 to $3 million. And the reason being is that the radioactive material, and you're not really getting a luxury car at that point either, you're just pretty much paying for gas. Also, nobody really wanted to drive on the road with a rolling nuclear reactor. Again, the major fears were what happens when these things break, and it's catastrophic. So, more Fallout aesthetic here. Let's get into the technology of aircraft. We have the Horizons airplane here. One of the noted features of this intact model, most of the games don't have an intact model. This is one that's been rebuilt, is these cooling intakes here. And I'll get to the inspiration of these in a second here. But we have the cooling intakes, and the idea is that the reactors for this plane are actually here. Now, there's a couple theories as to how they would actually use the nuclear reactor to power the plane, whether or not it'd be an electric turbine. There's also the idea that we could do what's called a pulse thrust. That's more in rocket technology. Pulse thrusting was a nuclear technology that basically used nuclear material to rapidly heat up the propellant, but in really quick bursts. The problem was that it also irradiated the propellant, and it wound up, what they not really discovered, what they already knew and why it was impractical, was because it shot radiation out the back of the engine constantly. So you can't really launch it off Earth. It just creates a wasteland, literally, where you're at. And so, but the idea was that these planes would be electrically powered, electrical turbines. Again, this is a little bit more efficient design than what it would have been in the car, because in plane design, you don't necessarily, they're much, much larger, so the shielding for passengers is a much lesser need. You can have it further away, use less, it weighs less. But what they found out was that not quite true. Here's a kind of more of what you see in the game of these vehicles, this plane. This is the Convair. This is an actual nuclear plane. Unfortunately, none of the, well, I say unfortunately, the reality is that none of these nuclear planes actually were powered by nuclear devices or any type of radioactive devices. They did have active running reactors on board. They were all pretty much left in the test phase. The reason that they were stopped was because it was too expensive to get them to work. Way too much overhead when it came to what happens if these things fell out of the sky. And they also discovered that it was far too expensive to shield the plane from radioactivity. But I'll show you sort of how they kind of put these things together. So this particular plane would originally be intended to be thermoelectric. A turbine would be inside of it that would create electricity to power our props here. And this section here is actually a cooling intake for the reactor itself. So this is the reactor that was loaded onto the planes for testing. Astonishingly enough, there were 48 flights of this particular plane for testing, and this reactor was up and running in the sky. And here are those same tubes that I mentioned before. These are the cooling tubes that would sit underneath of the plane. This is a different version of the plane, and the air would come in and basically come out radioactive. But it was so high up, they didn't really think much about it. But this was the small reactor. It's about the size of a car. You can kind of see the relative size here. Also gives an idea to the reactors that you see in the game Fallout, especially where the fusion cores are plugged into these reactors. The idea is, did we really have technology? Do we really have a technology to create such small devices? And this really is a nuclear reactor that's less than the size of your house. I mean, but again, there's no shielding. Most of what you see when you see a nuclear reactor is protective systems and cooling systems. That doesn't get it to say that we have nuclear submarines. We also have icebreakers, which are these vehicles that break the ice in the Arctic. Some of those are also nuclear powered as well. But the reason that we can kind of get away from those having so much shielding is because they're able to dissipate their heat and also able to dissipate it in a way that is such a minimal impact on the humans and the environment that's around them. And it pretty much only works in those extreme conditions. Deep in the ocean, extreme temperature cold in the Arctic, we're able to cool these things really quickly. So it reduces the incursion of radiation. The hotter it gets, the more cooling systems we have. The larger the cooling systems we have, the more chance of radiation exposure we have. In space, it's a lot different. We can actually radiate to space itself. There's already too much background radiation, but we can't really harness it because it's so random. Anyway, that's my tangent for that. This is a cover of Practical Mechanics. This was 1951. And there's an article in the magazine. Nuclear planes were our future. The future was atomic. Everything was going to be nuclear, and it was going to be wonderful, and it was going to be cheap. And, oh, by the way, we're also talking about speaker systems and a surf boat. But the main point here was that even Practical Mechanics, which became Popular Mechanics later on, very real article on the practicality of nuclear spacecraft and aircraft. Get us a little bit of fun here. We got Power Armor. Power Armor was an assistive system in the Fallout universe. The assistive system did two things. It protected the user, and it also allowed for assisted movement, increased strength, speed, also the ability to breathe in certain environments, take your medicine through the system, could illuminate things, night vision, depending upon what you had in the system. All around practical battlefield tank system to be worn. Pipe dream. Seems like this would be really neat to have. Would it change warfare? Is this something that's strictly related to war? Could we use something like this for peace? Could we use it for exploration? Would a spacesuit be practical if it was made from something like this? Again, philosophical, but we want to talk about how it relates to what we actually have in our real world. We do have them. We do have them. They're not armored, but this is an actual DARPA-created exoskeleton. This particular exoskeleton allowed the user to increase his lifting and maneuvering capability by about 50%. Not much of an increase, but when they created upgrades to it, the subsequent model had a 200% increase in effectiveness. But we don't see these on the battlefield. We don't see these in rescue missions. We don't see these. And the reason being is that we can't power them. The military uses what they call a metabolic equivalency. It has to do with how much food you have to give your personnel and how much work they have to perform in order to use these devices versus how the devices are powered. So say you have a person who's going to take 50 pounds of equipment and they only need roughly, let's say, 30 ounces of food per day. Now I know that the number may be off. Let's add into it the possibility that you want them to carry 200, 300, 400 pounds of material. We have to add into that how much that person will need to stop and rest. But would the assistive device give them enough ability to carry? But the batteries turned out to be even worse. What actually happened with this particular series was that the weight of the battery that would allow it to be completely untethered actually created a bigger need to generate thrust, generate the lift and not lift. I'm speaking aircraft terms, torque to lift that material. But the problem was that the more they wanted to lift, the more batteries they had to add. So it was actually the less they could lift. So if you wanted to add 50 more pounds of lifting power, you had to add 50 pounds of batteries. It didn't make sense. Also, it was not economically feasible. The other systems were all tethered. This actually did bear fruit, though, in our research. We actually wound up getting a system that was from the waist down for leg lifted assist, and those are deployed. This particular system, I don't know the name of it, but I think it's called the Hulk, which is the Human Universal Load Carrier. And Lockheed Martin and Exobionics developed this in 2010. And it's so you know the Exo-1 power armor. You don't know where they got the name. Well, it's from this. It's called the Exo and the Exo S2. So it's kind of funny that the power armor takes its name from that. Raytheon and Sarcos developed one of those. Both of these were full body suits for soldier mobility. Again, the downfall was that the power congestion. There was just too much power being consumed, not enough power being produced. Again, research, smaller batteries, maybe one day. Getting into some of our other technology, talk about combat armor. These combat armors were standard ballistic armor. Some of them offered various other benefits in the game. But for the most part, standard ballistic armor, lightweight, easy to wear, easy to transport. And we do have similar systems. I think this is called the Talos or the Talon. Check. Yeah, this is called the Talos. It stands for the Tactical Assault Light Operator Suit. It was originally given to the name of a robotic exoskeleton, but then later on they used it to designate any type of protective system that was developed. This is a prototype that has been developed here. This is a very real, serious bid for this particular type of protective system. I'm not sure if the chicken or the egg came first, but Fallout 4 was for the most part, introduction of that particular style of power armor, and this particular development does predate that a little bit. So art and life, is it a convergence, maybe? This is different deployments of the Talos system here. These are all battlefield tested. This particular Talos system in the middle and on the left, really, they do have the assisted leg enhancements. These are actually, the one on the far left here is a non-powered assisted system. The system was designed to completely remove leg fatigue from the wearer. Basically, essentially, every time he would walk around, all force and all impact would be absorbed through the leg system. The system in the middle is actually a lift assist system that connected to a harness that was worn underneath of the torso. And this actually enabled the user to lift heavy loads, push heavy loads. Again, cost and effectiveness and also the maintenance of these currently only really allow our 1 per 50 people in the military to use in our military technology right now. Again, part and parcel to the actual design of the technology. So for peace use, sure, I could see something like this possibly being used in, harder to reach areas, but we have a lot of other type of technology that gets us to hard to reach places too. This is a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek thing. I put this in here because somebody might bring it up. I'm not sure if most people do. This was actually developed in Canada. This was developed by a bear suit creator. He spent about $150,000 developing a suit that he claimed was the ultimate battle suit. It had built-in air conditioning technology, night vision. It had places where you could hide weapons. It had automatic morphine distribution systems. And basically the claim was that this would be the next Iron Man suit, of course, without the power. Yes?
I was gonna say, originally you were building that to survive bear attacks. And
Yeah,
it just got
yeah,
more and more,
yeah.
it's more and more crazy.
Yep, it was originally designed to survive bear attacks. Now, the claim was that the suit could survive a shotgun blast at point-blank range in all of its major plated areas. Of course, not in the joints, but that was a big feat in and of itself when it comes to technology.
Was it ever tested?
It was tested. The problem is that the claim was that the suit was a mere $2,000 to produce. This is cheap compared to how much the governments of most countries spend on this kind of stuff. It's super cheap, yeah.
Yeah, I think it was the suit also weighed a lot.
Right. It was about a 40-pound suit. Now, the 40-pound suit didn't have all the bells and whistles. The 100-pound suit did. So, needless to say, the suit never made it into production. It did do what he said it did. It was just not practical. Who knows? This, again, privately developed. So takeaway from there is that not all technology has to be, government funded. We could do these things too, but maybe not as successfully. But we like to think that it's in our hands. So yes, Barb. 15 minutes. This is the Russian developed. It's a little dark on this page. This is Russian developed armoring system. They actually have replaceable plating in this in case you get it damaged. The little plating pieces of Kevlar and ballistic plating can be removed and replaced. They're hexagonal shaped. And it actually can be reconfigured. You can see it a little bit better here. They can be reconfigured on the suit itself for various light to heavy protection configurations. And these tiles can, sorry about this. These tiles can actually be stacked as well for additional protection. The drawback being that the wearer gets limited movement as you add more pieces of armor. The helmet offers breathing technology. There is heads-up displays in these. There's also night vision technology involved. A lot of the rest of it, the neck piece has a cooling system in it, but for the most part, this is mostly just armor. So Barb said I've got 10 minutes left or 5 minutes left. How much time? 15 minutes left. So robotics. Got this little, this is a Sentry bot in Fallout Universe. These are kind of scary to run into.
They explode.
Explode sometimes when you beat them. They're essentially the equivalent of what's left over of whatever tank. If you run into an automated tank, it's basically what it is. Sometimes I hate these more than some other bad guys in the game, but they're up there on my list. I hate running into them.
Yeah. I don't think anybody likes running into a sentry bot.
Automated warfare is something that's been on the table since the 1900s. It's been written about in sci-fi for a very long time. Think about it. Our governments try to develop it. We try to develop peacetime versions as well. And then some governments come up with things like this. Turns out that this wasn't real, but it was kind of fun. It was a prototype. It did roll around a little bit, had limited functionality. Do you have another comment?
That actually is, it's made by a private guy.
It's real.
You can buy 'em.
You could buy them, but they're not.
They're not really, it's really slow moving.
Yeah, and there are also remote controls. These are remotely controlled. So, I mean, but the idea that we can kind of replicate something, our technology now, and if anybody's seen these Boston Dynamics videos on these wonderful autonomous dogs that they produce, our technology for automation is pretty good. Whether or not we want to put it into a war machine, that's another philosophical argument. Yes.
Did you actually watch the robot fight between this one, the Carrot's House, and that American?
Yeah. It's again when you're looking at these fights, so it's more or less what's the range of movement? What are we looking at here? But art, life, art. Clearly, maybe he's a Fallout fan. Who knows? But then we get into things that are more close to being real. Sorry for the quality of the graphic. We have our little surgical journal with our little medical protectron. Maybe we don't have these yet. We do have police protectrons. This is a very real bot. This particular robot houses a stun gun. Some of them house rubber pellet shooters, which is kind of funny. But mostly they just take pictures and call 911. There's facial recognition, emergency features. There's private companies who can actually get these in the U.S. I don't think they're called bots in the U.S., but the resemblance is pretty close, of course. In the Fallout universe, the design of the Protectrons are from usually Robbie the robot, classic sci-fi robot depictions. Of course, we like these designs since it's been depicted as generically friendly, and we see these things. So design carries over into real life. Of course, automation is sort of, with some of these companies, can be a little over-exaggerated. Antbot knows its terrain, knows its area, can generally, it can navigate by itself. It can connect wirelessly to multiple networks. It knows how to send messages. One would say that it is an automated system, but there is somebody behind the wheel, generically speaking, when these particular devices are deployed. And if you haven't seen one, it's mostly overseas, but there are private firms in the U.S. that allow you to deploy a bunch of these. I think the cost rental per month is like $10,000 per month to rent one of these. Per device, yeah. But you get full monitoring. You're not having to pay an employee, basically. And yeah, that's part of the argument is you don't have to put your personnel at risk. get security robots. Of course, push it over. It doesn't do anything. The idea being that, by the time a bad guy would be able to disable one of these, he's already had his picture taken, authorities have been notified, so on and so forth. Look at this Boston Dynamics picture of this. I say it looks like a dog. Barb thinks it's kind of creepy.
It is creepy.
The most recent test of this is the fully automated navigation of unknown terrain.
10.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And there's a video out there. I don't have much time, so I won't show the video. I wasn't really going to show the video, just want to talk about it for a little bit. But this device and a similar device had been depicted. It was let loose in a private construction area. It was told approximately where its goal was in the construction site. It was given a photograph of an area, and it was told to find it. So it wandered.
We're good.
So scary. It's a very exciting panel. And it did. So it navigated all the floors, basically using built-in circular photographic technology, radar, things like that. It did some analysis on the actual picture itself, looking for various features in the area. It was able to find it pretty quickly, but it autonomously navigated the site for about 3 floors until it found the spot under its own power. Of course, the camera crew followed it the whole time, got it on video. It's a very interesting exercise in the state of technology and where we are. Of course, maybe these will show up in the, oh wait, Sharper Image doesn't exist anymore, does it?
What?
I said Sharper Image doesn't exist anymore, does it?
No.
Is it just catalog? I don't know. Maybe this will show up at Macy's one day, who knows? But our automation technology is pretty good. More recently, NASA showed off their spheroid AI, which was kind of cute, I think. Of course, you see the use of these, and it's more or less, what did you ask the AI to do? Tell you the weather on Earth, play your music, turn on the oven. Well, not in space, but we like to think about it. There's our Securitron or Protectron design. And of course, finally, not necessarily a thematic concept, but the very real reality of reel-to-reel audio systems. This is a depiction of a computerized audio system in the home. Of course, most people have computers in their pockets now. Of course, the interesting concept behind this particular design here was that, yes, you too can repair your computer. We have an oscilloscope here for electrical diagnosis. Probe ports. Whenever it broke, you're going to pull these panels all the way out. Start probing it, repairing it yourself. This is being depicted as either being in the study. It's actually supposed to be a stereo system. It's kind of funny looking because you think it's concept art, but this is actually from an ad. It's funny that this particular idea that we would have these huge computers, but we do. Not necessarily a technology mirror, but yes, we're almost done. Okay, I'm rambling. We hope you like our panel.
Questions?
If you have any questions,
Anybody have any questions?
Subject stuff can be a little bit dry. We do like to have a little fun with our fandoms. We love sci-fi. We love science. We have a lot of fun.
Fallout.
We like Fallout. I love Fallout. And we hope that this has been sort of fun and informative for you. I'm glad you stuck with us. Yes.
I just want to say I really like now that also met Amos robot. I like how in Black Mirror.
What's that?
In Black Mirror. I like that.
Yeah.
Oh yes. It was featured in Black Mirror. The AI dog started hunting. Spoiler alert. Yeah, yeah.
Still
Our-
creepy.
Yeah, our fascination with modern sci-fi still has an aesthetic. We just modify it. Yes.
Hey, so I just wanted to point this out, apologies, because I came a few minutes late.
Sure.
Sorry if I missed this, but this was built as a panel, but it was one person, was the only male out of a two-person panel talking for an entire hour with slides. I think I heard maybe 5 words out of you out there.
Oh,
So I don't know if I missed.
I let him do all the talking. We're married. I don't know if you guys knew that. I let him do all the talking because he's really good at it. I kind of just freeze up and
I do apologize.
get really
So essentially,
stupid. So
the other-
I don't do the talking. He
the
does
other
talking.
half of the panel was coming up with the presentation. Barb pretty much supplied all the ideas and the technologies that we would review.
I just don't like talking.
Yeah, and she asked me to speak on most of the topics this morning, even though my voice is a little raspy. And so I do apologize if I did not mean to appear one-sided. We do appreciate multiple viewpoints from everyone.
Now, if we were to talk about cosplay,
Oh, yes.
I would, yeah,
Well,
that's my subject.
yes, in the front. Yeah.
About miniaturized and nukes before.
Uh,
And I remember in Metal Gear Solid, they had a thing called the Deadly Crockett. Was that real?
I mean, if you're talking about,
Most
yeah,
things in Metal Gear Solid were like real.
Yeah.
Or torture.
Oh, you gotta,
It felt a little
well,
far-fetched, so.
yeah,
It was real.
Yeah.
It was tested, but the thing is though that its blast yield was way bigger than like a Fat Man.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
at that point, they kind of realized at that point, they were realizing how dangerous radiation was, and the thing fired around multiple miles away, and the troops were still being irradiated.
Yeah.
By the blast rate. So they're kind of like, yeah, maybe not. It was
w-
impractical.
with the radiation technology and the radioisotope, nuclear type technology, detection of radiation from far away is bigger than what a lot of people think. When you fire a mini nuke in Fallout, you don't get a rad spike when you're a certain distance away. But in reality, if you really did detonate a nuclear device that was that size,
Thanks
you
for
would
coming,
definitely get
guys.
radiated at that distance. So yeah, yes, yes.
Just maybe what you were talking about, medical devices in the 50s.
Yeah.
Utilizing X-ray machines to make children's shoes fit better.
Yeah.
Yeah. Take X-rays of their feet so they can get the right shoes.
So
That's cool.
we'll try to answer questions until they kick us out. I'm not sure that, is the next panelist in here yet?
I think you guys have 4 minutes.
Oh, okay. I guess, go ahead.
So when you were talking about the conveyor, another weird part of that plane is that the propellers were rear facing.
Yes.
Do you know why they decided that on that design choice? Was it to make room for the radioactive?
Actually, that's the way the plane was built prior, because they converted, they converted it and renamed the plane. I believe that was the B-82. I can't remember. It was one of the B series bomber planes. It was converted that way. I believe that plane had a rear-facing props because it was something to do with the way that the bomb bay worked or something like that.
Efficiencies
Yeah, it had,
related to props, the closer to the leading edge of everything, figured out later on, you just push the prop out, that's why you got these engines
right, because it moved the,
big way out in front, but
Yeah, yeah.
first they figured out you put it behind the wing,
it's actually part of modern plane design as well, except we use jet engines now, and the thrust is from behind instead of a pulling, it's pushing.
As I said, it's a Russian Solar bomber that is dual, it's rear-facing props.
Yeah.
It's 2 counter-rotating props. Arcs each engine and backwards.
I did want to mention the idea of medical technology. At one point, there were a series of pacemakers that were used a radioisotope battery. And they went into production. About 40 of them were tested. The idea was scrapped not because of harm to the patient. It was a very small amount of material. but it produced just enough wattage of power to power the pacemaker for 80, 90 years. The problem was that once the patient was deceased, they had to be guaranteed that the device would be destroyed. Now, depending upon various requirements, belief systems or whatever the patient had or last requests, they didn't have any guarantee that the device would be destroyed. And they also found out that even cremation doesn't destroy the device. So part of what we learned about nuclear technology is that radiation, it's our friend, but we have to control it very, very well. It does not produce these wonderful mutations. It might, but it produces far worse than in its raw element. But yeah.
We're done.
Yep, we're done. Barb wants me to head out. Thank you so much for coming.
I don't want to head out. I want to talk more, but
Oh, I'm sorry.
well, I want you to talk more.
I want you to have fun at the show, though. So. Okay, thank you so much for coming.
Thanks, guys. And like I said, if you have any questions about the museum or Escape Velocity, just visit us at our booth.